compared to the first session, which was setting the general picture around the protocol, this is really focusing on the environmental issues. Hopefully we will make this more practical for you. Our attendants are more like looking at the environment. So the first thing I want to talk about really is the protocol is a very complex beast, but we can start understanding it by putting it in three different perspectives. First, by looking at the protocol and what it tells us about the UK-EU relationship, but also what it tells us around tensions potentially and abilities to work together between Northern Ireland and Great Britain, and finally North-South cooperation between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. So if we consider the UK-EU relationship, we have to consider two different texts. We first have to consider the protocol on Ireland and Northern Ireland that was part of the withdrawal agreement, but also the very recent trade and cooperation agreement. And it's by considering these two together that we can kind of really make sense of that new relationship, and especially for Northern Ireland. Some of you may be familiar with the backstop. We heard a bit about the backstop as well from Katie and David. That was kind of the agreement, specific agreements for Northern Ireland in the previous version of the withdrawal agreement. At that time, it was quite striking how ambitious the backstop was when it came to the environment. You had specific requirements for having a body or multiple bodies to kind of deliver environmental governance and environmental enforcement after Brexit. You had principles listed, you had specific areas of environment. In many ways, both the protocol and the trade and cooperation agreement are less ambitious than the backstop in the original withdrawal agreement are. And that's because it's a looser, less close relationship. But at the same time, we should not forget that even though it is less ambitious perhaps than what we could have had with a backstop, it is much more ambitious than what is the standard EU trade policy. So if we compare what's in the trade and cooperation agreement to what is in the EU-Canada or EU-Korea kind of trade agreement, this is much more ambitious. It's not standard at all to have a list of environmental principles in a trade treaty. So we have this, and we also have, for example, like really putting the emphasis on policy integration. So having environmental policy matter across a spectrum of public policy. It is also very important to see some very good words there in terms of governance. You need to have adequate and effective remedies. You need to have access to justice that is not prohibitively costly. You have requirements for transparency. A lot of this is something familiar for you if you are already familiar with the Aarhus Convention on access to environmental justice, access to environmental information. This is a lot of two signatories to a convention that have not necessarily done a great job at implementing that convention, but still kind of reiterating their commitment to access to justice, access to information when it comes to the environment. There's some interesting element there in terms of regulatory meetings between UK and EU regulators to tackle like shared issues. So this is a kind of, and we'll see it throughout the text, there are basically a lot of options for cooperation if there's a political will to do so. There's lots of legal options. Now, whether these will actually be utilized is still up to the politics of the day. We've heard a lot as well around questions around level playing field. So how to avoid an environmental race to the bottom, how to avoid environmental dumping. And here you have different elements in the protocol and in the trade and cooperation agreement. We have some dynamic alignment, as in Northern Ireland has to keep pace with developments in that the EU does in all the policies that are listed in Annex 2. Now, a proper dynamic alignment is reciprocal. Of course, this is not the case here. If Northern Ireland suddenly were to adopt an extremely ambitious piece of environmental legislation, the EU would not have to keep pace with Northern Ireland. So when we were talking about dynamic alignment in the overall UK-EU relationship, that was what we were talking about. Whichever moves like more ambitiously is kind of dragging the other with it. This is not, of course, the case with the protocol. It is also not the case with the trade and cooperation agreement, although there are some possibilities of rebalancing. So if you have one party that is much more ambitious, and that is because of that ambition, suffering through a reduction in trade, reduction in investment, certain kind of trade measures can be put in place to kind of rebalance that. So this is more ambitious than what you have again in normal trade agreements, but it is really linked to that impact on trade, that impact on investment. You have options for regulatory cooperation, critically building on areas of cooperation under the Good Friday Agreement for the protocol, much more general. And for example, really putting the emphasis on working together in international settings. So we have to look at what's going to happen in Glasgow for the next climate COP to see whether, for example, the UK and the EU actually use these possibilities for regulatory cooperation in the trade and cooperation agreement to kind of present a unified front when it comes to tackling climate change. They can if they want to. In terms of the environmental areas mentioned, we have some that are, so it's not listed but as an environment. You have the environment and energy efficiency listed together, but you also have waste, chemicals and pesticides listed separately, also GMOs. So there's actually a lot of that is in annex to that pertains to the environment or that would have indirect impact on the environment. So it's definitely something that environmental groups should get familiar with. On the trade and cooperation agreement side, it's quite interesting to see that environmental levels of protection that I mentioned really include chemicals, include also the impact of agri-food systems on the environment. So this is not just about, water or climate neutrality. While it is mentioned there, it is also like a very broad vision of the environment. Now, in terms of Northern Ireland and Great Britain, we have to consider how the protocol fits with common frameworks. As Katie explained, basically common frameworks, the need for common frameworks rose really from Brexit. So we had this idea that we have these powers that were Europeanized, that were dealt with in Brussels, even though they were at the same time also devolved. So you had, for example, agricultural policy that was in the devolution settlement competence of the Northern Ireland Assembly, but also mostly regulated through the common agricultural policy. With Brexit, the winds of change flows these balloons back either to London or to the devolved. Just this really nice graph from the Welsh Assembly Library back in 2017. Now, the issue with that is, of course, that if you have agriculture flowing in all the 4 different capitals, gradually you're going to have more and more divergence if you don't have that kind of common framework that provides some kind of general rules of the game. So there's been a big push between the 4 administrations in the UK to build these common frameworks that could be common standards, common objectives, or just ways of managing divergence by just being, having some kind of mechanism to inform the others what are your local plans, and to have to take into account when you plan your own policy, the impact it will have on the other nations of the UK. So you will remember this slide from Katie's presentation, where it shows this kind of overlap between the protocol, North-South cooperation, and the frameworks. And it tells you first that it is not simple as we have legislative common frameworks if it's areas covered by the protocol, non-legislative. No, it's a mess. It has, there's lots of different overlaps, and every specific issue has to be looked at individually because the content of the frameworks is not fully made public yet. Anyway, so there's going to be a lot of just learning on the job and having to find out what's happening on a specific basis. So the big sound you might have heard in the background was my cat just falling miserably on the floor behind me. So apologies for that. Now, so frameworks we know are supposed to adhere to the Belfast Agreement, the Good Friday Agreement. What we're seeing though is that actually, especially because we haven't yet seen all of these frameworks, a lot of this still has a lot of question marks after. We're seeing as well, so in general, as we'll see, I'll just show you an example of how it's going to work. Now, in terms of what's happening with North-South cooperation, we have an article. It's not just about Article 16. I wanted to show you another article of the protocol. There is one on North-South cooperation that really says clearly, of course, the protocol protects existing cooperation, but as you know, on the environment side, while there was possibilities to cooperate, not much has actually been done in practice cooperating. through the North-South Ministerial Council. So there are possibilities to do much more. Again, we'll need political will to actually unlock this cooperation. Now, what we are at now is that we have, in a way, 3 worlds of Northern Ireland environmental policy. So up to the end of the year, last year, we had EU environmental law, which is most of environmental policies in Northern Ireland was EU environmental law. And you also then had some examples of NI environmental law that was of UK or NI origin. Now what we have is 3 different bodies of law. You've got the directly applicable EU environmental law. That's what is in Annex 2 of the protocol. You also have almost like most of the acquis, so most of EU environmental rules have now been transferred to kind of retained EU environmental law. There's been some minor changes made to each of these provisions, such as, for example, if you needed to ask a derogation to the European Commission, now the derogation, you need to ask it to the department. Okay, of course, there's not going to be any role for the Commission in granting these derogations now. And finally, you still have your local rules as well. Now, these different rules, this different body of rules are going to have, to some extent, different governance arrangement as well. So if you're an environmental group, that means you really need to be confident about which, like that directive you're interested in which of these 3 categories it falls. So for example, if we want to dig a bit further, we can see all of these as pathways for cooperation and or set of constraints on NI environmental law. We're going to have our NIGB legislative and non-legislative common frameworks. We're going to have UK-wide legislation. Katie mentioned before the Internal Market Act, for example. We're going to have the possibility of regulatory cooperation under the Trade and Cooperation Agreement. We're going to have our retained EU law around the directly applicable EU law around in Annex 2 of the protocol, and we're going to have North-South cooperation in the Good Friday Agreement. Critically, it's not going to play out the same way in different policy areas. So if you are interested in air quality and waste or nature, you're going to have different rules to contend with. And that's something that is going to create a lot of challenges for environmental groups. Now, if we consider waste, we have both legislative common framework. It is also in the Annex 2 of the protocol. So we're going to have Northern Ireland dynamically aligned with the EU, but also bound by a common framework with GB. And also the ability to pursue and to expand upon pre-existing North-South cooperation under the Good Friday Agreement that has been done, for example, around tackling illegal waste. If you look at water quality, there's no common framework and it's not in the protocol. What matters is that, so that means what we have currently in terms of making sure the Water Framework Directive is implemented in a sensible way, considering we've got a single biogeographic unit, is the only cooperation mechanism we have. For air quality, you only have a non-legislative common framework, so very weak rules binding before at UK administration. For eco-label, here it is in the Annex 2 of the protocol, and it's likely going to be impacted as well by the UK Internal Market Act. Finally, for chemicals and pesticides, you've got your common frameworks, you've got your Annex 2 of the protocol. And chemicals and pesticide is going to be especially interesting to look at, because we have this new EU ban on lead sharks in wetlands that has been adopted at the end of 2020 under the REACH regulation. And that's going to come into place. And that's going to be one of the first example where Northern Ireland will have to update its pre-existing ban on lead sharks in wetlands. Ireland will have to finally adopt a ban on lead sharks in wetlands. And we're going to see North and South, this kind of policy change to both apply new EU environmental legislation that is included in the protocol. Now, that's policy. Governance is not necessarily a more simple and straightforward picture. In a lot of these Brexit discussion, we're talking about governance gaps. It's a very simple concept. It's just the idea that you had at one point the European Union fulfilling a governance function. That could have been policy formulation, monitoring, enforcement. After Brexit, there's a question of who, if any, is going to step in and replace the Commission and the Court of Justice in delivering these governance functions. And that's raises even more problems for Northern Ireland, which is the smallest out of the 4 UK administration, and so as much more pressure, for example, in terms of administrative capacity, to of course try to replace everything. And that's why we can, bit of a Viviane reference here. We can see kind of governance across time, space, and even scope of policy, and lots of different rules going to apply for different people. So we've got our European Commission and Court of Justice. They're not completely gone from the picture. First, because up to the end of December, you could still file in, file in complaints with the Commission. And we've had groups in Northern Ireland filing complaints on the Habitats Directive, on the Water Framework Directive until late in December. So this is going to be very interesting to see, because the Commission always has a choice, the political choice to kind of do something about these complaints or not. It's going to be very interesting to see whether the Commission considers these issues important enough to raise, or whether the current tensions between the UK and the EU are going to make it more or less likely for the Commission to use these complaints and to actually follow on from them. But for these rules that are at Annex 2, the role of the Commission and the Court of Justice did not stop back in December. It will keep on going. So you're going to have some rules that are still under enforcement mechanism by the Commission and Court of Justice. So we're going to have 2 tiers of environmental governance at least. Also, because Northern Ireland, again, is a small administration, it didn't really make sense to develop a new environmental governance body replacing the Commission and the Court of Justice for everything that is not covered in the protocol. So what they've decided, contrary to Wales and Scotland that did go their own way, they've decided to opt in on the English proposal for an Office for Environmental Protection. Now, that decision is not completely finalized, because the environmental bill that has been mooted since at least 2017 has yet again been delayed in Westminster. So it's yet again been withdrawn and is likely to be introduced only in the autumn. So that means we're going to have interim arrangements when it comes to the Office for Environmental Protection, at least until then. And so further delay and further questions around what it means exactly for Northern Ireland to be part of a Just England Northern Ireland body. What kind of representation for Northern Ireland, all of this. These are kind of debates we're going to be having potentially only just at the end of the year now. And finally, Northern Ireland is one of the rare parts of the continent of Europe that doesn't have an independent environmental agency, and that has been a bugbear for a lot of environmental groups here. A promise of delivering an independent environmental agency has been included in the New Decade EU Approach agreement that was signed to bring the Assembly back. It has been in many ways delayed as well post the establishment of the OEP. So it is still kind of mentioned as something that needs to be done. But first, the idea is first let's plug the Brexit governance gaps and then kind of address the other ones. Now we'll see whether that can still hold, considering that if we are having so much delay on the establishment of the OEP, we might actually now have a window of opportunity to push for an independent environmental agency. So to conclude, uncertainty remains. It's been, and I'm sad to say that this is, uncertainty has been, there since at least 2016. In many ways it remains. It's not that we don't have clarity on some aspects, we do, but the problem is environmental issues, there's going to be so much overlap between the common framework, the protocol, the trade and cooperation agreement, the good friday agreement, political relationship between these islands, that it's very hard to have a clear picture even today. We have a lot of opportunity though to cooperate. The problem is whether we're going to have political will to actually do so, especially considering that cooperation on both north-south and east-west bases can really be undermined by political tensions. COP26 in Glasgow, so coming November, is going to be that key test to see whether the UK and the EU can actually manage to work together on the environment still, despite Brexit. But there is also a problem, because it does see that, if we look at the trade and cooperation agreement, a lot of it is around climate. If you care about any other environmental issues, there is a risk that climate cooperation continues, but perhaps the rest of the environment gets a bit forgotten. And that's all for me.
That's great, Viviane. Thank you very much. Yes, lots of layers of governance, complexity, etc. We have lots of questions coming in on the chat, but I think we'll wait until Mary has spoken as well to get to those. Mary, are you online?
I am online. I don't have a cat, and I don't have slides, but I do.
You do have a baby.
Yeah, sorry. The only way I can survive this is if I continue to hold him, because otherwise he'll scream the house down. And so this is how we're going to continue. So this is going to be mainly a response to Viviane, partially because I only volunteered to do this yesterday afternoon. But what I want to think about is really to do, and I suppose because I'm coming from the legal aspect of it, is to do with the enforceable obligations that exist, or whether they are really enforceable to an extent as well. And then going back to the divergence, whether it's likely and whether cooperation is feasible or not. And in doing so, I want to go, thanks, Sean. Sorry, there are comments coming in, which I'm also responding to. Not just looking at the Northern Ireland Protocol or the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, but also thinking about the developments that have been happening within the UK. So Viviane and Katie in particular were looking at some of these in relation, for instance, common frameworks, but there's also the Environment Bill that Viviane mentioned, and also the Internal Market Act, but also the likely EU developments, which I will touch on really, really briefly, as in just the idea of it. Okay, so if we start with the Northern Ireland Protocol, most of this has been gone through, and we've seen Annex 2. We've seen that there are legal obligations that are there, that basically Northern Ireland has to comply with the list of EU laws that are contained there, including as they automatically update. So the EU goes and introduces amendments to those pieces of legislation, or it introduces replacement pieces of legislation. Northern Ireland is automatically bound by those, including then bound by the EU governance system that applies to it. But in the context of the environment, that's really, really narrow. There is the benefit, if they were willing to take it up, which is that the UK and the EU can agree to expand that, and they can agree to expand it, including through the cooperation of the Joint Committee on the Northern Ireland Protocol. But they can expand this area to go and say, we're willing to go and have these other areas of environmental issues to be covered by it. That would obviously be great, because it's a relatively strong regime. It's what exists currently, essentially, or it's the approach that exists currently. There's a really interesting point that was raised at a different workshop I was at regarding trade and goods, which is that actually, even though there's not meant to be a border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, or between Northern Ireland and the EU, if you're sending goods from Northern Ireland into the EU member states can actually impose something called measures of equivalent to quantitative restrictions. And that includes environmental restrictions. So they can say, well, actually, we want you to produce your goods in a specific way. That's not allowed between EU member states, but it is allowed between an EU state and a non-EU member state. And even though there's not meant to be this border, there is this weird loophole that has been left within the Northern Ireland Protocol. We were wondering in the previous workshop whether this was some sort of mistake, slip somehow, but it seems really unlikely. And there was someone who worked for the Commission there that said, no, it wasn't a mistake, as in the European Commission. So EU member states can still impose measures equivalent to quantitative restrictions, which include, for instance, criteria in relation to production mechanisms. Moving on from the protocol, you have the Trade and Cooperation Agreement. The one thing there that I would flag, so we've heard a lot about the sort of the principles that are there, the idea of, I was sort of going, let's keep in touch. Let's have this sort of, we'll have discussions about how we can improve areas in the future sort of thing, really fluffy. And then you have the non-regression principle, which I know I've had discussions with members from NGOs here who are listening today. And linked to that, I should say, plugging for Ciara Brennan, who isn't here, I am also a member of the Environmental Justice Network of Ireland as well, so representing that at the same time. But we all wanted this non-regression principle, but it's limited to level playing fields, is limited where there are impacts on trade and investment. So it's only in this specific narrow context that you can raise it. And it's considered to be very difficult to go and actually enforce. So it's a nice idea, very happy to see it there. Don't know how actually useful it'll be in practice. Plus, it's only about non-regression. It's not about alignment, and environmental regulations are continuously having to evolve, mainly because we haven't a clue about our understanding of the environment and human impacts and everything else. So we always need to evolve and develop the regimes we have, and we always are basically hurting the environment more and more. The situation changes. Someone asked in the questions whether if Northern Ireland improved the environment, could this be raised as a breach, basically, of the protocol or of the trade and cooperation agreement? They do not cover improvements being in breach. So for me, that would be a no. Also, the next person sort of went, could this even be an issue as in impacting it? And like, no, because I can't see it, even if it were really covered, how it would cause a problem, because the only people it hurts economically are the people who have to abide with it in that regime. So if Northern Ireland does it, it's an economic disadvantage or competitive disadvantage for Northern Ireland producers, not for the EU member states. So I don't see how that would be a problem. I'd love if Northern Ireland, having lived there for many years, would take on that challenge and go for it. We'll cross our fingers on that one. That's mainly it for the obligations. I mean, you have the common frameworks, but so few about the environment that have been included. And water quality is the one I always flag with Viviane, going, for God's sake, how is that not deemed to be required to need a common framework, but just not there. So Northern Ireland on its own for the main part when it comes to the environment and developing it, which links in to divergence. And I'm trying to keep this relatively short, so we've got plenty of time for discussion afterwards. Plus with him, who knows what the hell will happen in a minute anyway. But for divergence, I suppose what I'm thinking about is whether divergence is likely and whether cooperation is possible or is really going to be possible or not. And I don't really just mean cooperation. In fact, I do not mean cooperation on a governmental level. I mean cooperation on a day-to-day basis between the regulators, between the actors who are there, who actually have to implement and deal with the legislation that's already in place. Because it's always possible for governments to cooperate if they want to. There are always mechanisms, and we've seen those through the Good Friday Agreement with North-South Ministerial Council. All of these things facilitate that sort of cooperation. But the question is whether the day-to-day actors are actually able to cooperate or not, and also linked into that, whether there's divergence. The more divergence that there is between the regimes, obviously, the more difficult that cooperation becomes. Because if you don't share the same objectives, if you don't share the same standards or the same processes or governance mechanisms, it is much more difficult to cooperate. And in the context of most of this looking at Northern Ireland, but also GB to an extent, we all know at this stage, environmental governance is devolved. So Northern Ireland gets to decide what it wants to do for the main part within the UK as regards environment. That's applied within the EU, but within the common framework provided by the EU system. Now that's going to be removed for the main part. So Northern Ireland has the devolved powers. Like Ireland, has not got the best history with environmental governance previously, doesn't have the best political will all the time, is pretty dire economic constraints, has the Brexit situation as well, has COVID-19. There are a lot of pressures. So there are a lot of fears and concerns about what will happen. And Viviane has also flagged in relation to the environmental governance mechanisms and those shifting. We have the Environment Bill, which, yes, hasn't been passed yet, but interestingly, it has a schedule in it that enables, specifically is granting extra powers to Northern Ireland to change their governance approaches to specific areas, including, for instance, water. And within this, they facilitate changes to the way they monitor the quality of water and how they evaluate the status of water. So within the EU system, we would have shared approaches for transboundary waters, firstly. So within Northern Ireland and Ireland, you would have 3 transboundary river basins. We must cooperate with each other in relation to its governance. We have the same objectives, we have the same standards, we have the same monitoring, we must both report to the European Commission and so forth, or we both did need to until Brexit happened. This bill facilitates them changing the definition of what counts as good, what they're looking for, how often they monitor. If you don't have that shared governance mechanism, it is much more difficult for there to be cooperation north and south of the border. It doesn't mean that Northern Ireland will change this, but it's opened up that door even further. It just needs to be pushed a little bit more. And then that cooperation on a day-to-day basis becomes much more difficult. And that's despite the fact that that's one of the areas where there are shared borders, shared bodies to deal with this. and it's specifically covered by the Good Friday Agreement or Belfast Agreement in relation to that. It's one of the 6 areas that are, it's one of the bodies created within the 6 areas. There's also the environmental draft environmental strategy created by Northern Ireland. So it is taking proactive steps to try and develop things. I would love to see that being developed further, but I realize there are a lot of pressures as well. But there was some great work done there by the civil servants whilst they were missing the executive. And nearly done. There's the Internal Market Act then, and that is, whilst it applies mainly to GB, it has significance for Northern Ireland as well. For those of you who don't know about it, passed recently, it has the principle of mutual recognition. It operates differently from the EU principle of mutual recognition. Essentially what it does, it means that any good that is authorized for sale or use in one part of GB is automatically authorized for sale or use in any other part of GB. Now, it is mainly focused on GB, not in Northern Ireland because of the protocol. But firstly, within GB, this means that if there are exceptions to this and stuff like that, but they're very limited. If Scotland, for instance, wants to introduce a restriction to protect the environment, and if it fulfills the specific requirements regarding the way that it works, it will not apply to any goods that are authorized for sale or use in England or Wales, including ones that are imported into GB from outside of the UK entirely, or indeed from Northern Ireland. And this means that whilst Scotland can improve their environmental standards, they can't apply the same rules to these imported goods, which means their goods are at a competitive disadvantage, which undermines the attractiveness of introducing these rules in the first place, and may undermine the effectiveness of them as well, because if just across the border, England are going and continuing on doing whatever they want, it weakens it. It gets way more complex than this, but basically it's bad and can lead to further divergence, but in a downward spiral instead. Northern Ireland's not affected by this directly, but if Northern Ireland producers want to import their goods into GB, the rules apply to them once they're on the market. So they're competing against goods that are basically having the lower standards applied to them. And so there's a temptation within Northern Ireland to reduce those standards where possible as well. So it's, sorry, but I thought it was not a group message, it was a direct message. Thanks, Viviane. And then this basically also indicates the UK government attitude, shall we say, that it's trade above environment. And that's really concerning for the future. That's it on the Internal Market Act. And then I already said about continuously evolving on the EU front. So that has the fact that even if there isn't divergence within the UK, within the EU, if there's divergence in any way, whether it's upwards or sideways or anything, that all again makes it much more difficult to cooperate. It's not that there's this divergence right now, as Viviane correctly pointed out. It's that this divergence is going to evolve and develop in the future if we're not part of the EU, which we're not. I've been living there too long. If Northern Ireland and the UK are not part of the EU, which they're not, that divergence is going to increase. I think that is probably it as regards what I wanted to say. And I answered the question that I wanted to answer. So with that, I'm going to shut up and leave it open to Q&As.